Alright, so the Halo TV show ended about a month ago, and I did an episode by episode, essentially bitch fest about every single episode and how bad it was, and went into the detail and how they broke canon and how they didn't follow the rules in their own show and everything. So I want to talk more about where it went wrong. This isn't going to be as detailed as the weekly videos that I did, or episode by episode videos that I did. This is going to be more about the broad decisions that they made at a fundamental level that I think caused the show to be as bad as it was. Now that we have the entire picture, I feel pretty comfortable doing this and discussing where I think they went wrong. So the topics that I'll be discussing, there's mainly four of them that I think are where the show really didn't even have a chance to get off the ground to be a decent show. The first one is they didn't seem to understand the background of the Spartans and why it was important and why it was done the way that it was done. The second is the way they treat the characters, and they made them very one dimensional and very flat. I don't know if any character has any real development, or at least not good development. The third thing that I want to talk about is the action scenes and how their lack of attention to detail or logic makes them have no weight, and really, I think, puts them in a bad position in the future because the show is going to have a second season, apparently, unfortunately. I want to talk about the changes that they made in relation to the canon and why I think the way that they did their changes was a mistake. This is going to be things like having a human antagonist within the Covenant instead of an alien, things like that, and how they really impact what the original themes and messages of the games and books are. And they don't really do anything to replace these to make the show interesting or to make the characters interesting. Alright, so if you're here, go ahead and like and subscribe and all that shit, and let's get into it. So I think one of the biggest decisions that was made right off the bat that really hurt this show was this hormone pill that made them just killing robots. And that's how they refer to them in the show as well, repeatedly, is killing machines or killing robots. And I'm mainly going to talk about John in this regard, but this applies to all the Spartans. In canon, they don't have anything like this. They're indoctrinated as children because they don't want to risk their performance suffering by messing with their hormones and stuff that they don't have to mess with. And Halsey doesn't want them lied to as kids because of the betrayal that they might feel when they figure it out, or if they figure it out, and how they could lash out and how they could act, which is exactly what happens in this show. So John is supposed to be the protagonist of our story, and this is going to be a pretty ballsy thing to say here, but the protagonist of your story should be likable. And if they're making questionable decisions, the audience should understand why they're making the decisions that they are. Usually it's for a bigger, noble goal. Another approach, which is what the games did, is to have the chief represent the audience, or the player in the case of the games, and the characters around him are what really drive the story and who you get attached to. So the first thing that we see in this show is that John kills a bunch of aliens, and when a teenage girl is the lone survivor of a mass murder by these aliens, he ignores her and doesn't give a shit. So immediately, we're starting with our protagonist not giving a fuck about innocent civilians, and then he agrees to execute the survivor of this mass murder on a ridiculous order that makes no sense. And this decision ripples throughout the show. This could be a part of his arc if we were to see him actually caring about civilians later and caring about people who weren't necessary for his missions. Because you could make the argument that it's the logical thing to do since Kwan doesn't have any mission value to ignore her. But what purpose does killing her even serve? And we never get that scene of him caring about civilians or innocent bystanders or people who don't matter to the mission later to sort of pay this off. So I think that was a really bad choice pretty much right out of the gate. And instead, what they do is he pops a pill out of his spine area. I guess it's just floating around there. And he becomes mentally unstable for the rest of the season. They use this hormone pill as an excuse to just have him be an emotional maniac all throughout the show. Getting angry and shouting at people, falling in love with a Covenant spy just because she's nice to him, trying to kill Halsey, who's his mother figure, disobeying orders, questioning orders that he shouldn't be questioning. And this also presents an issue because they have Kai watch John do it, and then she does it also. But why would she be motivated to do this when she still has her pill? And the thing that sort of activated John was because of this Forerunner artifact memory hallucination thing that he had. Kai didn't have that, so she just does it to mimic him. And then she also becomes emotionally unstable. And on the flip side of this, the two Spartans who don't have theirs removed, Vanek and Riz, are willing to execute John later and show that they're literally killing robots. But Vanek and Riz have some kind of emotional awakening in the finale, even though they never take their pills out. Or not that we see, at least. So these hormone pills are all over the place. They're not really consistent. They don't really have consistent impact on the Spartans as we see them. Soren also took his out when he was young. They don't have the same reasons for removing them. They don't have the same response after they removed them. John becomes a psycho. Kai becomes like an awkward weirdo. Vanek and Riz, I don't know what happened to them. I guess maybe they just overrode theirs somehow. So yeah, this hormone pill thing is just all over the place. And it's a shame because it would have been so much simpler to do something similar to the lore where they're indoctrinated to be mindless soldiers, but they're also proud of what they've accomplished. And this allows them to have conflicting emotions, which is much more interesting than just robot or psychopath. The reason they have these conflicting emotions is because they hate that they didn't have a choice about what they did with their lives. They were forced into it at 5 and 6 years old. But they also can acknowledge that they wouldn't have become like the saviors of humanity without it. So on one hand, they respect Halsey and they're grateful because of what they were given the opportunity to accomplish and how much they've accomplished that they probably wouldn't have if they had had a normal life. But they also hold a grudge against her because of how she went about it. They were taken from their families and didn't have a choice to be enlisted and all that stuff. A lot of them are dead or wounded. I'm pretty sure they can't have kids. So all of this is a lot more interesting than what they did with these pills, which is essentially pills in bad, pills out emotionally unstable. And they all hate Halsey. And it's kind of a strange message too, if you go all the way through the season, where Parangoski in the last episode says to John, we need the Master Chief, not John. Like John is portrayed as the good guy all season for being overly emotional and kind of crazy. The way that they frame it is he's justified for these emotions. At the end, they say what they really need is the killing machine. So it's a really mixed bag of what they're going for with this. So yeah, my whole point with this first part is that they just don't seem to understand the background of the Spartans and why it was done the way that it was done. So even a change that I would consider a pretty big change with these hormone pills, maybe you consider it a small change, but either way, it has all kinds of other effects besides how they got their mindset of becoming soldiers. And this impacts the entire show in a negative way. The next thing I want to talk about is the way that they treat the characters, because even aside from the Spartans, which they pretty much destroyed with these hormone pills and a bunch of little decisions along the way, I guess I'll start with Halsey because she's kind of the focal point of the show and really of the Halo universe in general, outside of like the Master Chief and a few other people. They go out of their way to portray her as the incarnation of evil at every turn. She kidnapped the kids, replaced them with clones, which is all in the books. But in the books, this is a decision that she's constantly struggling with internally. And she's doing this thing where she rationalizes it as correct, but it never gets framed as a good thing by any means. In the show, they treat it as though this isn't enough to make her a bad person, or certainly in the gray area if you're being charitable. They add these backstories in where the Spartans have to raise and kill their own pets. The way that they talk about Cortana and the approach to Cortana in this show, it isn't to enhance John where they're partners and she's in his suit like in the books. She literally wants to give the Spartan bodies over to AI. And this specific one is John and Cortana. At the end of the season, she says that she's happy about John finding a girlfriend. And then 5 minutes later, she's sending orders to have him brought to her and says Cortana can have his body once she gets a hold of Maki. I mean, throughout the show, she repeatedly neglects Miranda over and over. She forces Miranda to talk to her by stealing her clearance and locking her out of the system, only for the purpose of her fake crying so she can steal Miranda's clearance for her work. She's just an absolute piece of shit throughout the entire show, to the point where it's almost cartoonish. Like, the only good thing that she does in this show is save Miranda when Miranda falls on the battlefield in episode 5, which, when you look at everything else, this is just an out of character moment. I wouldn't even call it a good moment. It just makes no sense compared to how she's acted the rest of the show. You know, you can have just pure villainous characters who everything they do is evil. But for the Halo universe, this is just a completely missed opportunity, and I think it makes it really dull. And she's a piece of shit. That, to me, was also just a horrendous decision before the show even got going, really. So the next character I want to talk about is Captain Keyes, who they also turn into a villain in this show, kind of. In the books, he's with Halsey as she's looking for the children and going to watch them and all that. But as soon as he starts to question it or put the pieces together, Halsey has him pulled from the mission. And this is something that he figures out later on, and he regrets it, even though he can't deny how important the Spartans are for the war. And in the games and books, it's also implied that he and Miranda were really close, and that Miranda looked up to him so much that that's why she joined the UNSC. In the show, their relationship is really strained the entire time. Miranda is pretty much smarter than him and just constantly lecturing him and talking down to him, while he looks really weak and apologetic. And it's really weird that they took a character that was very likable and I would say a good character, even if you haven't read the books, just in the one game that he's in. And they made him shit. In the books, he's a really good tactician. He's very honor-driven. Like, when he gets taken over by the flood, he just keeps repeating his name and service number so that the Gravemind can't get any information from him about Earth or anything like that, or its colonies. You know, they took this character who was just a morally good, likable character, and they turned him into a generic UNSC officer. It's a very strange decision that made the show worse. Parangoski is another character that I want to talk about. She wasn't a huge part of the show, but she definitely has an important role. And in the books, she's very competent, ruthless, and manipulative. And the show, she kind of gets bullied by Halsey and outwitted by her and manipulated by her until she just gets so irritated that she arrests her. And she also does really stupid things in the show, like listening to John when he says they should trust Maki right after they betrayed him. I don't really even know what they're going for with Parangoski's character, honestly, because in the lore, she's also the head of ONI and kind of like the de facto head of the entire UNSC because of it. She's really intimidating and really scary, and none of that comes across in the show. And she also just kind of feels like generic Admiral lady. Like, they just didn't understand the character, so they flattened her out and made her boring. And one of my favorite things in the books, and this is in the Kilo 5 trilogy if you're interested, Glasslands, Thursday War, and Mortal Dictata, she's talking to her AI about the stuff with Halsey, and one of her biggest regrets is that she let Halsey have so much freedom, knowing how Halsey is. And she also openly says that the Spartan program and all of that is her fault as well. So she takes fault for it, but she also wants Halsey to be held accountable and justice to be served type thing. So her way of that is pretty much to try to get as much out of Halsey as she can and also kind of make her life miserable. Like, I like her a lot in the book. So yeah, it's just a shame what they did to her. So the next character I want to talk about is Kwan, since she was pretty much a main character. I mean, she had her whole own side story. And I'll just go ahead and say her entire side story was completely irrelevant to the season. It shouldn't have been part of it at all. They probably should have used that time to develop the other characters more, like Parangoski, like Halsey, like Keyes. But as far as her character goes, what would you even say to describe her? Her only goal is to free Madrigal from the UNSC. Which, let's just be honest, her only goal is completely fucking retarded. They were just attacked by an alien species that they had no chance of defending themselves against. And she wants to be away from the UNSC, who's pretty much the only group that can protect them. Her only attributes are that she throws tantrums and then gets her way. She serves as a plot point for John in episode 1 as part of his emotional awakening. And in episode 2, he just dumps her off and he's like, alright, see ya. And then she has her whole wanting to free Madrigal arc. But they didn't even give her a good bad guy. Like, I like the actor who plays Venture, but he has nothing to do in this show. They try to get some shots of him looking cool, and he shoots some people in the head. Quan just kind of goes around asking people for help, has a hallucination about what I'm assuming is going to be the portal to Halo at some point. I wouldn't be surprised at all if next season they started off with saying Madrigal's free and, the Oracle comes out and they take the portal to the Halo. And they even point out when she's in this hallucination with the Desert Witches, they say she's consumed by rage, and what has your rage gotten you? And in her fucking vision, she throws a tantrum, John helps her up, and she gets her way. So, like, what the fuck? Like, what lesson is learned here? She didn't develop at all from episode 1. She's literally the same annoying-ass person the entire time. Soren is probably the only interesting character in the show. He at least has an interesting background because he left the Spartan program early because he was defective. He ended up having a family on his own. And he became a space pirate, but he's kind of like a Jack Sparrow pirate where he's not really evil. He's just kind of trying to get by. And he just wants money and to protect his family and his little colony, the Rubble. And, there's some dumb stuff in his arc. The whole thing with the motorcycle breaking down and Quan tricking him was absurd. But the actor did a good job, and he was probably the only charismatic person in the whole show. I liked Key's actor also, but he was just completely wasted. Soren is at least interesting because he's kind of torn, because he wants to keep his word to John and protect Quan because they have their Spartan bond. And he also has his own wife and kid in the Rubble to think about, which he's responsible for. And it's a shame that they didn't have better writers who could really maximize this. But, at least that concept is good and makes for an interesting character unlike a lot of the rest of them. Alright, so the last character that I want to talk about is Maki, since she's the main antagonist of the show. The concept of a human traitor in the Covenant isn't a terrible idea, but they went about it in a really stupid way. And this is the kind of lack of understanding of the lore that I've been referring to that just destroys the universe, and they don't even realize it yet. Like, the idea that only 1 in a billion humans can activate Forerunner artifacts completely destroys the Covenant hierarchy. The Covenant believes that the Sansheum, or the Prophets, are the only ones who can deeply study and understand the Forerunner artifacts and maximize their utility to push their technology forward. And this is how they establish dominance in the Covenant hierarchy. The idea that they're dependent on a super rare special type of human to use them and to learn about them is insane. I'm not sure how they would have ever gotten to power in the first place with this kind of system. Like, how do they keep this a secret when they're sending out these massive crews to go hunting for these blessed ones with their magical blessed one finder rod thing? None of these things make sense, and the lack of understanding of the lore really fucks them over with that decision. As far as Maki as a character goes, she is completely nonsensical. The first half of the show, she hates humans, we see some cops beat her up, she releases the hunters on the crew and then pledges to bring back John's head to the Prophets. She meets John, he interrogates her, they go for a walk through some flowers. Fuck. She decides to leave the Covenant after getting the Spartan D. And this moment is when they find out that she was the one who attacked the human ship with hunters, and she gets beaten up again like she did with the cops. So she steals the artifact and goes back to the Covenant. Like, this is just fucking insane. And if they wanted to do this kind of thing, what they really should have done is either one, they should have dragged it out for like 3 seasons so that she has plenty of time to learn about humans and consider her thoughts and blah, 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 and then finally switch sides. And then later she can realize that humans are just as power hungry as the Covenant and switch back, whatever. Or they should have had her be essentially being forced and tortured to comply to the Covenant. But, that way when she flips, you're like, oh, okay. Like, yeah, they were forcing her. She didn't want to be there, so she sides with the humans. Instead, she's a religious zealot, so all the evil shit that she does can't be undone. If she had been forced to do stuff against her will and then betrayed the Covenant, only to find out that the humans and the Covenant both covet power for their own desires and whatever, that they could have gotten deep into that and had kind of a philosophical thing there about power and whatever. But instead, they just made her like a schizophrenic person. And her character was shit because of it. And this was a pretty missed opportunity to have an alien character and really get some insight into their culture, their technology, their beliefs, their hierarchy, all that shit, like their day-to-day life. And instead we get this weirdo human who leaves the Covenant almost immediately and then just acts like a human. So that's another just missed opportunity there. And I think it does boil down to a fundamental lack of understanding how the Covenant operates. All right, so that's kind of it for my main character by character breakdown. The next thing that I want to talk about are the action scenes. From what I've seen online, they're the most praised part of the show. And there's really only 3 action scenes with the Spartans. Maybe 4 if you count the fight in episode 8 between Jon and Vanek and Riz. The first one I actually thought had a decent start in episode 1, where the Covenant is just brutally murdering everyone at the outpost on Madrigal. But there's a lot of little neglected details here, like the turret not working for the rebels, but then it works when Chief uses it. I'm not going to get into all the detailed stuff. I already did that in my other videos, but some of the CGI was wonky, and it was an okay scene overall to get the show started, I thought. Unfortunately, we got no more action until episode 5, and this is where I start to have issues with the action scenes. It starts off with their ships getting shot down, which is pretty cool, but they do have some things here that make no sense tactically. Like, they have both sides run full speed at each other, but they're all using shields and guns. But they wanted the shot of both sides running at each other like it's a fantasy movie. But in a fantasy movie, they only have swords and close-range weaponry. So something that's kind of weird in this fight, too, that's more of a big picture thing, and another area where they don't understand the lore, and it's going to have long-term consequences if the show keeps going, is they have jackals using swords in this fight in episode 5. Physically that's fine, I guess, but the jackals are supposed to be cowardly scavengers and pirates. Elites use the swords because they have an honor culture like samurai. So this is why jackals use shields and snipers and distance weapons, on top of the fact that they have frail bodies. So if we get into more of the alien culture later on, the Covenant culture, this kind of thing is going to make no sense for the jackal culture. Things that are done in the lore, in the books and games and everything, are done for a reason. And this kind of stuff I think is going to fuck the show over long term. So the next couple of parts that I'm about to talk about are my biggest issues with the combat in the show as a whole, and definitely in this episode. And these two things, when you combine them with what I'm going to talk about from episode 9, are going to be a huge problem going forward, I'm guessing. The first is that Kai has this panic attack in episode 5 and gets shot by like 100 plasma pistol bullets. And I don't think that this is even an exaggeration. She's literally just laying on the ground for like a couple minutes getting shot by a jackal and a couple grunts just staying there shooting her over and over. And the other part of this that I think is just really bad, and this might be people's favorite action scene from the entire show, is where Chief jumps onto the Banshee and flies it into the Phantom, and then they both explode, and the Chief just pops up like nothing happened. And then he goes on this rampage right after where the Covenant just run up to him so that he can shoot him in the face with a shotgun. And these scenes are going to be a huge problem in the long term, because what you just did is pretty much make your Spartans invincible. And this problem gets exacerbated in episode 9, because when you have your Spartans survive shit like this, where they can fly at the speed of a Banshee into an explosion between two ships, and they're getting shot dozens or hundreds of times, when the time comes to kill one of these Spartans, you're pretty much going to have to drop a nuke on them. Because otherwise, we have to assume that they would be safe, or it's going to be inconsistent. And this is another just wasted opportunity, because they easily could have had a couple little lines of dialogue. Well, first of all, they could have had Chief drop off the Banshee like half a second early and roll. And like the explosion still hit him, but not be at the center of the explosion. And they easily could have just thrown a line in between him and Cortana, where Cortana's like you tore your ACL and you have 3 cracked ribs, Chief. And he's like, and then, he responds, whatever. It doesn't matter. And then fights. And that's, that way you show that he can be hurt. None of that shit was in there. So this just makes the Spartans seem invincible. And the last big action scene is in the finale, or episode 9. And this one starts with the problems for me almost immediately. They jump from pretty much the upper atmosphere to the surface And I don't hear them use boosters or anything to slow their fall. So I'm assuming that they're landing at terminal velocity. And I rewound this little part like 3 times to see if I could hear anything, and I couldn't. So maybe they did, and I'm just missing it. But this kind of durability is absurd. And it only gets worse from here. The next big problem I have with this scene is the fight with the brutes. They made the brutes look like fucking giants compared to the Spartans, when in reality, they're a little bit taller, quite a bit wider, and all muscle. So they're pretty fearsome without this exaggerated size that they did in the show. I really don't understand it. So they have the Spartans like blocking hammer swings and shit. Like John blocks one with his assault rifle. But because they don't understand scaling, it's just completely unbelievable and it looks ridiculous. Like at one point, a brute chokeholds John and lifts him off the ground, and John's feet only go down to like his waist. And the brute headbutts him in the face and it hurts him. Like these brutes would be completely unstoppable. They're like twice the size of the hunters. And it makes it even more ridiculous when right after this, John is laying on the ground and gets a gravity hammer to the chest and he's fine. And something here that was a really bad decision on their part was to cut to John's heads-up display, and his shields are depleted, but he just keeps getting shot over and over and over. And the brute chieftain hits him with the gravity hammer and he flies like 100 feet into the wall. You know, if you want to do this scene, just show that the shields are like half full. You can't show that he has no shields and that he keeps getting attacked, but he's fine. I mean, what's the point of the fucking shields then? And then also, we know that he's never in danger. And, you know, what this also does is make the brutes seem like bitches. Like, you have all these brutes just beating the shit out of these Spartans, and they're all fine. So this is just bad all around. And what follows this is insane, where Cortana takes over John's body. She dual wields plasma pistols. We just saw Kai get shot with like 100 of them and not die. But Cortana just fucking mows down everybody with them. And these action scenes are just atrocious to me. As soon as you get past like the style and the aesthetics and the nostalgia and, you know, just the excitement of having a live action Halo, yeah, it's just bullshit. And I'm not going to get into it here, but there's a million times where they take their helmets off in battle situations. They have tons of chances to shoot the prophets in this finale, and they just don't. John, in episode 8, fights off 2 Spartans in their armor when he's not wearing armor, which can only make you ask the question, well, what the fuck's the point of the armor then? And the list just goes on and on of stupid shit. But I don't want to get into all the detailed stuff. This is more just broad thoughts about the parts that I thought were the most destructive action scenes. Alright, so the last thing that I want to talk about is how this lack of understanding the lore and all these changes they made that they don't really understand the ramifications of. You know, the Spartans and their backgrounds, the way they developed the characters, having a human antagonist in the Covenant, all of this stuff really impacts the messaging and the themes of the lore. And these changes that they made, to me, create a sort of death by a million cuts type situation. Like, I'm not sure if any one single decision ruined the show, but the culmination of all these little things that they changed that create inconsistencies just chip away at what could have been a great show, and they just turned it into shit. In this last part, I am going to be talking about the books and the games, just so you have reference for what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the messages and themes relative to the show. I would say that the biggest message of Halo from the human side is the question of, do the ends justify the means if you have a noble goal? And this is a question that in the books and games, I'm not sure if it ever really gets answered. Halsey is constantly trying to rationalize to herself that what she did was right because it saved humanity. But what she ignores is the actual intent of the Spartan program was to quell the insurrection. So it was to save humanity in a manner of speaking, but this is sort of like the Darth Vader killed your father thing to Luke. You know, obviously the Spartan program worked out because the Covenant happened to show up right after, or shortly after. In the books, this is also something that she clearly regrets, because in First Strike, which is the book after the first Halo game, it picks up right where the first Halo game ends. She figures out that Sergeant Johnson has a super rare disease. I think it's called Bourne syndrome, if I'm remembering correctly. And that's why the Flood didn't take him. So she gives this information to John and tells him that he can turn the information over, but it will probably get him dissected and not benefit everyone. But there is the smallest possibility that it could save billions of lives. Or he can destroy it and save Johnson's life and not sacrifice him for the greater good, the way that she sacrificed John. And the entire point of this scene is that she doesn't want John to sacrifice the few to save the many, because that's a mistake that she already made and already regrets. And it's a great scene. It's a really good lesson in the book. It's a really tough lesson for him to learn, because he's always had the philosophy of sacrificing himself or the soldiers around him or the Spartans to complete the mission for the greater good. So this is like a really great character development for him. In the show, because of what they did to Halsey, all she does is talk about over and over how she was right. And she doesn't really seem to give a shit about what she did that was wrong. And because she's this caricature of evil, you can't have moments like this. Like, she pretty much kidnapped the children, tortured them, and is willing to hand their bodies over to AI as if she hasn't already done enough to fuck them over. And this is the kind of shit that I'm talking about. When you think these changes aren't having a huge impact on the story, but in the books, she's trying to find a way to save the Spartans, and she really cares about them. So all of these little changes to Halsey's character completely shift one of the main messages and themes of the story. On the Covenant side of the story, I think the most obvious message and the biggest one is the criticism of extremist ideologies, or ideologies where you don't really have the right to question the people at the top. And this is something that we get in Halo 2 and 3, but especially 2, because we had the Arbiter's perspective, which this show threw out in favor of introducing Maki. And I'm not sure that they understand the significance of a change like this. It doesn't seem like a big deal, like, oh, changing one alien to a human. From the Arbiter's perspective, and his fight with the heretic in the game, we learn that the prophets deem any elite too powerful or who has too much influence a threat, and they name them the Arbiter, which they glorify as a promotion, but really all they do is send them on suicide missions over and over until they die, honorably for their religion. And that's the way they maintain their power. They also need the humans to activate the Forerunner artifacts because they can't actually do it, but they plan to lie about it. They're pretty much false prophets of an extremist religious group, and the Arbiter learns this when he's betrayed and finds out the truth about the Halos. This causes a schism between the people who accept the truth once they're exposed to it, and the zealots who believe blindly. And this entire thing is great. But they chose to have Maki as the alien representative, and they introduced these Blessed Ones, which undermines all this shit. So we don't get any of the insight that we could have gotten into their culture and their beliefs and their values. They could have literally just created a new elite, called him whatever, had him take Maki's place, and put him in charge of killing John, or finding the artifact, or whatever. Pretty much the same thing, just don't call him a Blessed One. Or maybe do call him a Blessed One, make him a threat to the Prophet's power. And there's so much that you can do. I think it was a horrible decision to undermine the perspective that we get from watching the Covenant from the inside. And it really undercuts the messaging and the themes that we could have gotten. In favor of nothing, really. Some of the other messaging in Halo that I don't think is quite as prominent, but still would have been nice to see, includes things like soldiers actually questioning orders. This show would have you believe that they're all mindless drones and will just follow orders no matter what. Just like we see in episode 1 with the order to execute Quan, and every person along the chain of command just goes, oh, okay. Yeah, execute a 17-year-old girl for no fucking reason. There's a really interesting message to me in Halo 4 about where do you draw the line between your job or your duty and yourself. Obviously, Chief draws this distinction when he's talking to Lasky between soldiers and humans. And Lasky says, they're the same thing, Chief. And this is a really interesting conversation because this wraps up Halo 4 with Cortana's death, and I think they're both valid points of view. If Chief started individualizing and prioritizing people over his mission, that could have catastrophic results and even more people die. But if you view yourself as nothing more than a tool that just serves people around you, your own life suffers in other ways, or you could be thrown away haphazardly. And obviously Master Chief is an extreme degree, but I think that regular people struggle with this in their day in and day out lives all the time. This also plays to the mentality of Master Chief, who has a very win-at-all-cost view, and this starts to come into question when he loses Cortana. And this is something that can never happen in the show now because of the relationship between him and Cortana. And this show elected to have Chief go from literal robot to maniac so that we don't get to see any of this stuff, which is a huge downer. And they've completely destroyed his relationship with Cortana. Him and Cortana hate each other like the first 8 episodes of this show. And at the end, she takes over his corpse. In Halo 4, he has to watch her go crazy. And it's pretty brutal to see. This show, because of this injection into the brain thing they did, has also completely taken away that possibility as far as I'm concerned. I don't see how you could possibly extract Cortana from him. And I guess they're just not going to do rampancy because then Chief would have to go crazy. And I think what makes all of this worse is that they neglected all of these really interesting and nuanced messages and themes and sort of, philosophical perspectives. And what was the message of this fucking show? The only messages that I got were that soldiers are mindless robots, police are brutal, being overly emotional is a good thing. And that might be the biggest one, is the being overly emotional is a good thing. Which sounds like a fucking insane claim to make, but repeatedly throughout the show, people are rewarded for being overly emotional. Kwan literally just yells at every person she interacts with and throws a tantrum, and everyone gives in to her. She always gets what she wants. John is portrayed as like mindless killing robot episode 1, and then once he has his emotions, suddenly he questions everything and likes music and he's a good guy and fucks the girl and all that shit. Miranda literally yells at her dad and shames him in front of other military personnel. He is her superior in rank, as well as her father. And he ends up essentially just sniveling in front of her the whole time and kind of kowtowing to her. Maki is cold and heartless until I guess she falls in love with Chief. I don't know what you would call it. Because they just meet and fuck and the relationship is nonsensical, but whatever. And then she becomes a good guy. I don't know what other message you could get from this fucking shit. That pretty much wraps up my thoughts on where this show went wrong in the big picture. I know you can get into more specifics like dialogue, acting, nitpicking the logistics, how no one seems to have a fucking chain of command, how every single thing that John learns is through a hallucination, how Kwan learns through a hallucination. I mainly just want to talk about the broad picture because to me, it seems like a lot of decisions were made before a script or specific story was even written that just completely destroyed the fucking show. I don't know if this show ever had a chance to work just from these decisions that seem like they were made with complete disregard for the canon. I mean, the reason that there is a canon is so that everything makes sense, so that you understand why things happen the way that they did. So small changes can have a big impact in the broader story. And I think this show suffered from a ton of small changes that just destroy the larger story. So that's all I'm going to say about the Halo TV show. I'm really tired of talking about it because it was so disappointing. I guess until they do a season 2, I'll probably do a weekly video for that, just like I did this one. And I'll probably do a similar video for the Obi-Wan Kenobi show to this one if you're interested, where I sort of talk about the big picture decisions that completely destroyed that fucking show before episode 1 even started. And they just made it worse all along the way. Alright, well that's it for me for this one. Thanks. See ya.